Good morning and welcome to the TCI Transportation Climate Initiative Reference Case Modeling Results webinar. This is James Bradbury with the Georgetown Climate Center. I notice a lot of people are still logging on. Attendees are just joining. So we'll give it just a minute or two before we start. We'll get started very shortly. Thanks for joining. Okay, good morning. Welcome to the TCI Transportation and Climate Initiative Reference Case Modeling webinar. My name is James Bradbury. I'm the Mitigation Program Director at the Georgetown Climate Center. I'm here in our office with Joe Kruger, our Director of Research and Strategy, and also other colleagues from Georgetown. Joe will be helping me review your input and questions and tee up questions for the speakers today. I'm also here in our office with Francis Wood, Director at On Location, conducting the modeling on our behalf, on behalf of TCI. On the line, we have Christine Kirby, Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Air and Waste at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Christine serves as the co-chair of the TCI Technical Analysis Work Group, along with Chris Hoagland, the Maryland Department of Environment. Chris will be presenting after this introduction in just a few minutes. We also have Brian Wood from the Agency of Natural Resources of Vermont, who is a member of the work group, the Technical Analysis Work Group, and he may chime in as well to answer questions. So I'm going to start, before we get to the formal presentations, with brief background on Transportation and Climate Initiative. For those who aren't familiar, TCI is a regional collaboration of Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. They're working together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. In December of last year, TCI states signed on to a public statement in which they agreed to develop a policy proposal by the end of this year that would cap and reduce carbon emissions from transportation through a cap and invest program or other pricing mechanism, and allow participating jurisdictions to invest proceeds into low carbon and more resilient transportation infrastructure. As part of the process, states are conducting technical, environmental, and economic analysis to inform the policy proposal by the end of this year. Here at Georgetown Climate Center, we serve the states. We help to facilitate this work, contributing technical and policy and legal analysis, convening, and support for this region-wide stakeholder effort that goes along with this. The focus of today's webinar is to present results from the reference case modeling and final assumptions that were used as input. This follows an earlier webinar on May 23rd, in which your comments were invited on assumptions to be used as input for the reference case modeling run. Just to explain what I mean by reference case. So before analyzing the potential benefits and costs of a future cap and invest program, the purpose of the reference case is to model a business as usual scenario to estimate what the region's transportation and energy system would look like in the absence of a regional policy. So the reference case estimates emissions, vehicle sales, and other variables in the transportation system, such as vehicle miles traveled, and that'll be presented and discussed more in detail on the webinar. And this webinar is part of a broader ongoing stakeholder engagement effort, and the details of which are available on the TCI website, www.transportationandclimate.org. TCI has also hosted 3 regional public workshops in April, May, and July. You can get the details of those and recordings on the TCI website. And additionally, individual states are engaging with stakeholders through meetings and outreach over the course of this year. So just before we turn it to the next presenter, just a few logistics. Webinar attendees can submit questions at any time throughout this webinar in the question box, which is in a panel on the right-hand side of your screens. Then you want to make sure to press send after you type in your question, otherwise we won't see it. And as those come in, we will be consolidating common questions and paraphrasing so that after the presentations are completed so that the speakers can address those questions. webinar will be recorded and available on the TCI website within the next few days. Also, the slides will be posted and publicly available. Finally, please note that any comments or input regarding this webinar or future policy runs may be submitted via the TCI website. There's a public input portal, a form for comments, which allows you to attach other documents in addition to your comments. So please do also use that portal for more detailed comments you'd like to share with the states. Now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Hoagland.
Thanks a lot, James. I'm Chris Hoagland with the Maryland Department of the Environment, and I'll be talking a bit about what a reference case is and what the assumptions are that we've incorporated into this reference case, and then on location we'll walk us through some results. Just first, a note on the role of modeling in this process. The quantitative models that we're talking about today are sort of just one set of tools we have available, and the modeling output is just one source of information that we'll be drawing on during the regional policy design process. As James mentioned, we've also held regional meetings, and states are having state-level meetings, and you can submit comments to the website. So the model is the modeling framework is one source of information among many. So first, for the reference case, what we're going to be talking about today, the reference case is a projection of what happens in the transportation sector to emissions, fuel use, other aspects of the system in the absence of any TCI cap and invest program. The assumptions that we put into the model are very important in terms of determining what the model says is going to happen. So we held a webinar on May 23rd to discuss what those assumptions should be. We received a lot of input. We've incorporated that input. We've run the model now, and we're going to share the results today. So now that we have this reference case in hand, which again tells us what the model says is going to happen in the absence of a cap and invest program, then we'll evaluate potential program design options in what we call policy scenarios, where we apply a carbon cap and we apply investments in clean transportation to this reference case, and we see how results change as a result of those programs. So next slide, please. So here's a quick recap of the last webinar. It was on May 23rd. The link at the top of the screen, which you can't click because it's in a webinar, but you'll be able to click as soon as we post these materials. That link includes the materials from that webinar and a recording of that webinar. We received a lot of input on a number of topics. The most salient ones here that we're going to discuss today are 4 categories of assumptions to put in the transportation model. The first is electric vehicle costs, especially battery costs. Electric vehicle model introduction years. This is what sorts of electric vehicle options for different vehicle classes will be available in particular years. A third one is vehicle miles traveled, or VMT projections. Vehicle miles traveled is what it sounds like. It's an estimate of just how many miles people are driving in different vehicles every year. And the fourth category was federal policy, the federal fuel economy and vehicle emission standards, how to deal with the uncertainty in terms of what the federal policy is going to be going forward. So we'll talk about those 4 categories of assumptions in detail, because those are the ones on which we've received the most input last time, but the materials that we'll be posting include information on other assumptions as well. So all of the submissions we receive are posted online at the link on the bottom of your screen. So you can see what sort of suggestions we received after that May webinar. Next slide. So going into the assumptions, the first is electric vehicle costs. One of the major components of the cost of an electric vehicle is the battery. So we identified that as an assumption to discuss with stakeholders last time around. The model we're using comes sort of with built-in assumptions from the Energy and Information Administration, specifically their 2018 Annual Energy Outlook, that's AEO 2018. We identified some alternatives to those assumptions in the last webinar, including recent analysis by NYSERDA. NYSERDA is a New York State agency, the New York State Energy Research and Development Agency. Some stakeholders after the webinar suggested using an alternative data source, the latest projections from Bloomberg. Bloomberg New Energy Finance puts out annual estimates of electric vehicles. So all of those options I just mentioned are displayed in the graph on your screen, which shows electric vehicle battery costs in terms of dollars per kilowatt hour. On the vertical, and on the horizontal, it shows sort of the next 20 years. The blue line is the AEO 2018 estimates that were preloaded in the model. The red line is the NYSERDA estimates, which estimated that batteries would be substantially less expensive. The line is lower down on the graph. And the green line at the bottom is the Bloomberg estimates that some stakeholders had suggested, which shows that batteries, or projects that batteries would be less expensive than the NYSERDA analysis and would also decline in cost faster. So what we've adopted in this reference case is a hybrid approach. It's shown in that purple line, where it begins with the Bloomberg estimates, which Bloomberg tailors to recent market research, and then over time converges with the NYSERDA estimates, which are sort of less optimistic about step changes in battery technology that could really substantially lower costs below the $100 per kilowatt hour range in the future. So that hybrid approach is what we've put into the model, and you'll see the impacts shortly. In addition to the battery costs, the model also considers non-battery costs. It's effectively the balance of other costs of manufacturing an electric vehicle compared to manufacturing a gasoline vehicle. We also adjusted those, drawing on that same NYSERDA study, as well as another study by the International Council on Clean Transportation, or ICCT, that drew on engineering estimates from the firm UBS. That's a lot of alphabet soup, but the point is that there are sort of multiple data sources available in terms of estimating what electric vehicles will cost in the future, and we drew on a mix of them from the state of New York, as well as those external sources, and links to all of the studies I mentioned are down at the bottom of your screen. Next slide, please. So after we changed all of those estimates about the component costs of electric vehicles, that then determined purchase prices for light-duty vehicles of various classes. This slide shows just two representative ones: mid-sized cars and small SUVs. In each of these graphs, you'll see there's a blue dotted line. That's the projection within the model. This is the EIA data in terms of what a conventional gasoline vehicle costs in that class. And then the solid lines represent the purchase prices of various ranges of electric vehicles, 100-mile in red, 200-mile range in green, and 300-mile range in purple. So you'll see from these graphs that with these updated battery and non-battery costs for EVs, for mid-sized cars, 100-mile and 200-mile range EVs fall below the cost of a conventional gasoline vehicle by 2030, while 300-mile range EVs for mid-sized cars remain more expensive than conventional vehicles. For small SUVs, all three of those EV ranges become less expensive than gasoline vehicles by 2030. Just in terms of comparison to some other sources, since we didn't adopt the long-term, more optimistic battery costs from some of those sources, the year in which various ranges of EVs achieve price parity, this is the year in which they become less expensive than conventional vehicles. In our analysis that you see here, is sort of slightly less optimistic than some of those other data sources, particularly for the longer range EVs. In any case, the projections here that show that EVs become increasingly less expensive over time will influence how the model decides what types of vehicles people purchase every year, and Francis will go over those results shortly. Next slide. The other EV-related assumption was vehicle introduction years. This table shows when the model assumes particular vehicles of different classes and different fuel types become available. The rows along there are the different fuel types, and the columns are different classes ranging from cars to light trucks. And we highlighted in that red box there, those are effectively electric models of light trucks. We brought these assumptions to stakeholders in May because in the built-in assumptions, many of those classes were assumed to never be available. They were any sort of cell here you see that's highlighted in red with the year 2051 effectively means that particular configuration is never available. So based on input from stakeholders and a review of the latest manufacturer offerings, we updated the year in which many pickups, vans, and SUVs would have electric models available, and those years we've updated are highlighted in green. So they are available to the model to deploy. So thanks for that input. Next slide, please. The next assumption is vehicle miles traveled. Now, in the model we're using, NEMS, VMT is actually an output, not an input. NEMS isn't designed for us to tell it how many miles people drive every year. It's designed to tell us how many miles people drive every year. However, we wanted to ensure that this analysis process is consistent with other ongoing state transportation planning efforts. So we calibrated the growth in VMT in the different regions of the TCI region according to state level projections. So total VMT includes several categories. It includes miles driven by cars, light-duty trucks, commercial light trucks, and freight trucks. In our projections, light-duty vehicles and commercial light trucks account for the vast majority of vehicle miles traveled, 93%, with freight trucks making up 7%. In that light-duty component, LDV component, we project about 8% growth in vehicle miles traveled from 2022 through 2032. I'll explain why those dates are important shortly. While for freight trucks, we are projecting relatively higher growth of about 10% over that time period. Next slide, please. The final category of assumptions was federal vehicle standards. The corporate average fuel economy, or CAFE standards, are currently scheduled to improve through 2025, meaning that vehicles that the manufacturers are offering for sale have to become increasingly fuel efficient over time. The current administration has proposed freezing that growth much sooner. This is a significant source of uncertainty in the modeling. We brought this to stakeholders in May, and what we've decided to do for now is to assume that the current standards do take effect as scheduled through 2025. Some stakeholders had suggested that we should assume not only that they take effect through 2025, but also that there's some improvement after 2025 based on some anticipated future decisions by the federal government. We've identified that as an assumption to explore later in sensitivity analysis. Speaking of sensitivity analysis, next slide. What sensitivity analysis is when we explore the impact of alternate assumptions, where we vary some of these assumptions about what's happening in sort of the background of the program, not the policy in question that we're trying to evaluate, but stuff that happens in the background that affects the impacts of that. Sensitivity analysis is when we vary some of those assumptions to see what happens. So some of the high priority assumptions that we've identified that we should explore in further detail in that sensitivity analysis are EV costs. What happens if they're more expensive than we've projected here? What happens if they're less expensive than we've projected here? And also the federal government vehicle standard decisions. What happens if the fuel economy standards are in fact rolled back versus what happens if they were to continue to improve in the future? So we've identified those as assumptions to explore in this sensitivity analysis later on, and we welcome input on any other assumption changes to explore in that step of the analysis. Next slide, please. So those are the assumptions. Next, we'll move on to results. But before On Location walks us through those, just a couple of things to note. The states are focusing the attention in this modeling on results through 2032, although the model does run through 2050. The reason for that is that the policy scenarios, the next step where we're applying different policy design options, would reflect hypothetical carbon caps that would take effect around 2022. So looking at results through 2032 would effectively capture the first 10 or 11 years of any program. Obviously, impacts after 2032 are very important, especially since we're talking about investing in transportation infrastructure that is very long-lived. So we'll be incorporating ways to consider those impacts in the long term. However, given the sort of exponentially increasing uncertainty as you look further and further into the future, for the purposes of these stages of the analysis, we're focusing our attention on that decade. So you'll see in the results that we're presenting now, many of them are shown through 2032, and that's the reason for that. So with that, we'll go into results.
Thank you, Chris. This is Frances Wood from On Location. I'm going to walk through some of the results from the reference case we developed with TCI. But first, a quick overview again of the model we're using for this process. It's the National Energy Modeling System, NEMS, which is an integrated energy model that incorporates both the supply and production demand of energy by various fuel types, projects energy consumption by end-use sector, includes electricity and petroleum refining that are conversion sectors. NEMS was developed by the Energy Information Administration, or EIA, which is an independent agency within the Department of Energy. NEMS is used primarily by EIA for its annual energy outlook, which many of you may be familiar with, as well as to perform analyses for congressional and other agencies upon request. The model is used also extensively outside of DOE and EIA by various groups, various non-governmental organizations, as well as the private sector, for producing baselines as well as doing policy analyses. NEMS projects annually through 2050 and has a significant amount of detail by both fuel and sector. For this study, we're focused on the TCI region. The transportation model within NEMS is organized around census divisions. So for this study, we're looking at the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, and we have separated the South Atlantic Census Division into two, into the Upper South Atlantic region, which is comprised of states that are participating in the TCI process, and not splitting out the part that is not participating. So the results here will show are really focused on this particular with three subregions, this whole TCI region. So first, to follow up on what you've seen previously about the electric vehicle prices and how they are projected to decline over time as battery technologies improve and other system elements improve. And this leads to increasing electric vehicle sales, EVs, in both the car and light truck submarkets. You saw previously there the different classes that NEMS provides, but here as a total for all LDV sales, you can see that by 2032, EVs are comprising a larger share and grow to about 1/3 of sales by that 2032 period. In terms of annual vehicle miles traveled, again, the total here is been calibrated to the state's forecast, but what's interesting here is the share of sales by technology type, and those sales then translate into vehicle miles traveled as the stock turns over, as the stock rises and more vehicles are bought over time, resulting in a share of VMT for the light-duty vehicles to 16% by 2032. So how does this result into the bottom line projection of interest, which is fuel consumption and CO2 emissions? Both of these you can see in the period between 2016 and 2032 are falling. And in fact, it's about a 20% reduction between this period of interest between 2022 and 2032. And this reduction is caused by a variety of factors. The most important or primary drivers are increased fuel economy in both light and heavy duty vehicles, as well as increased electric vehicle shares that we just saw in the light duty vehicle market. And that is a summary of the projections, and I will now hand it back to Chris.
Thanks, Francis. So now that we have this reference case in hand, which gives us estimates of what's going to happen in the absence of any sort of cap and invest program, the next step is to evaluate different program design options in policy scenarios, which, as I explained earlier, means that we take this reference case and now we add a carbon cap and we add coincident investments in clean transportation options. And we see how things change in the model to evaluate the potential impacts of those policy design choices. So we welcome input on the entire modeling process. The link on your screen is to the online commenting portal. And so now we'll open it up for Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Francis. We have a number of questions coming in, and thanks to those of you who are adding questions. Just reiterate again, any of you as attendees can submit questions at any time in the question box on the panel on the right-hand side of your screens. Make sure after you type it in, you hit send so that it transmits to us. So one thing I think maybe we do have some questions about where the NEMS modeling fits into the broader modeling framework that TCI will be using to inform policy. So, Chris, I wondered if you could address that question. I think having that a little bit of context would help folks on the webinar better understand where this reference case fits in and the role of NEMS as well. So I think we have a slide on this in the appendix, which we'll pull up momentarily.
Great. Okay. Yeah, thanks. So for this modeling process, we're sort of trying to answer 4 interrelated questions here. The first one, moving sort of from the upper left corner and going clockwise, is how does the cap, if we apply a carbon cap to the transportation sector, how does that affect the sector, as well as other sectors? We've drawn on NEMS here as a multi-sector model so we can capture the changes that might occur in the electricity sector, for example, through increasing vehicle electrification. So that's the first question, is how does the cap affect the transportation sector? But a very closely related one in a cap and invest program where the cap is implemented via an allowance system where we auction off allowances to raise funds for investing in transportation. So a very closely related question to how the cap affects the transportation sector is how do those investments affect the transportation sector? So those 2 questions are very closely related, and I'll go over how we've secured modeling tools to explore that. But then once we sort of explored that, then the questions we move on to the bottom of the screen, which are sort of what are the impacts from the program as a whole, what are the economic impacts, what are the public health impacts, and who bears those impacts? How are the benefits of the program distributed across different households and industries, et cetera? And so NEMS primarily is in the upper left corner. Do we have another slide after this, James? Yes. Okay. All right. So this gets complicated, but this effectively maps back to those 4 questions. What we're talking about today is really in the upper left, NEMS. This is an energy system model that sort of will tell us sort of different ways that the transportation system will comply with any sort of carbon cap. And then we've drawn on lots of different modeling tools to answer all of those other questions about how the investments work. Up on the upper right, there's something called the investment strategy tool that was developed by Cambridge Systematics for the states. And then we've secured access to a number of other modeling tools to explore the impacts in the bottom half in more detail, the economic impacts, the health impacts, and exploring how those impacts are distributed. And those will sort of all feed into our exploration of what different program design options would achieve. But again, for the purposes of today, we're focused on the upper left corner here, NEMS, which explores in depth how the transportation system responds to different cap and invest program design options, which will then feed into all of our detailed impact estimation later on.
We have a couple of questions here about the scope of what's covered in the modeling exercise. What portion of the transportation sector, what types of emissions are covered, and also included in that is does this cover electricity sector emissions in the analysis? And Chris, I wonder if you could take that one on.
Yeah, why don't we move back to the Francis's slide showing emissions. And the emissions that are being displayed on that slide are from, there they are, from motor gasoline and on-road diesel. So it does not include non-road diesel. It does not include aviation gasoline or aviation fuels. That's what those emissions that we're displaying up on the screen right now encompass. The model, as I mentioned earlier, is a multi-sector model, so it is accounting for impacts on the electricity side, and those will be important when we're exploring policy scenarios where we might be, increasing electrification of light-duty vehicles or heavy-duty vehicles or buses, because the model will then sort of understand that now we need to generate electricity to charge up those batteries. So we will have that electricity side information as well. But what you're seeing on the screen right now is just emissions from the combustion of motor gasoline and on-road diesel within the TCI region.
Yeah, Chris, and just a follow-up on the electricity sector, a couple questions. Is there the capability to look at those emissions with the model?
Yes, and that's going to be a very important thing for us to consider, as I mentioned earlier, as we look at scenarios where electrification plays a larger role. And we discussed some in the materials that we'll send out. There is information on assumptions we made for the electricity sector. We did discuss those at the May 23rd webinar. The model is accounting for the impact of all the relevant state programs on the electricity side. For example, RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the existing Cap and Invest program in several of the TCI states, state energy efficiency programs, state renewable programs. Those have all been incorporated into the model, and they will, influence sort of what happens on the electricity side as we in some of these scenarios as we transition energy use on transportation from these liquid fuels toward electricity.
Thanks very much, Chris. This next one is for Francis. I think there are a number of questions coming in on non-EV vehicles and how they're treated in the model. And, I'll just note, I think a reason for focusing on the EVs in terms of the modeling results is that's a big driver in terms of explaining why emissions from this sector go down over time in the reference case. But Francis, could you speak a little bit more to other vehicle classes and types? And there are questions about PHEVs, hydrogen vehicles, and so forth, thanks.
Sure. As sort of went by on that introduction year slide, the model contains several different vehicle types explicitly, including 2 different types of plug-in hybrids with shorter ranges and longer ranges, with 10-mile range and 40. It includes conventional hybrids where you don't plug into electricity, but they're much more efficient conventional vehicles, diesels, flex fuel, ethanol, they can take E85 or gasoline, as well as hydrogen fuel cells and compressed natural gas, which is hasn't really been a player in the United States. So all of these are included in the model as options. I think as James pointed out, we've been focusing on the EVs both because of the expectation of technology change in that area, which makes them more affordable, and also an interest here as we're thinking about gasoline and on-highway diesel consumption and emissions. The EVs provide a method to reduce those emissions substantially.
Question for Chris. A couple of questions raised that relate to using current CAFE standards in the reference case, and you had mentioned the sensitivity, but a couple questions about why was the decision made to include the current standards in the reference case and not reflect the proposed rollback of standards?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. We don't know exactly what the resulting policy decision will be at the federal level. So given that uncertainty, we decided to adopt what's often standard practice, which is to reflect policies as they exist on the books right now. And in that case, the current standards are still scheduled to take effect. There are proposals to change that, but for now, not knowing how that's going to turn out, we decided to, assume that that we reflect current policy, but explore changes in that through this sensitivity analysis, where we vary it in particular ways to explore how that uncertainty can affect the overall results from the model.
It's Christine Kirby. I just wanted to add to that. I think one of the other reasons is that a number of states in the TCI region do have California standards on the books. So in the event that the federal government rolls back, we will still be able to rely on the California standards that do go out to 2025.
Thanks, Chris and Christine. Appreciate that. We also had a question about the period of interest. Why is the focus on the modeling period is, 2016 to 2032, but the period of interest is described as 2022 to 2032. So Chris or Christine, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, that would roughly reflect the first 10 years of any hypothetical program. If you sort of imagine this year we spend on this policy design process, and then if states decide to go forward, spend the next couple of years going through their legislative or regulatory processes is appropriate. So a hypothetical cap could take effect as early as 2022. This is really a modeling assumption. We need to sort of assume particular years for the purposes of exploring these potential policy design options. So 2022 is sort of the earliest a hypothetical cap could take effect, and then we would want to consider impacts for at least a decade, which would get us out to 2032. Again, there's sort of given long-term uncertainty when we're looking out into the future. There's a point where things get increasingly hazy. So for now, we're suggesting this period of interest would be roughly those 10 years, 11 years if you include 2022.
Yeah, question for Francis. A couple of questions about what's included in the assumption about vehicle costs, particularly for EVs, and the slide that compared EV vehicle costs with conventional vehicles, and specifically, does it include federal or state subsidies in those costs?
So the prices shown in those charts do not include the subsidies. I think in the previous webinar, there was a discussion about the federal EV subsidy, and there is an assumption that fades away over time because of the manufacturers, the way the subsidy is set up to expire as subsidies reach their 200,000 production levels. So this graph with the prices here just shows the price before any federal or state level subsidy.
But in
the details on that subsidy, we do have a slide on that in the appendix, and it'll be in the materials.
Yeah, and in the reference case, there are assumptions made about, like you said, the federal EV subsidy that's accounted for in these projections, and also likewise for state subsidies.
For state subsidies.
Do you want to?
Sure, and another question. There are some questions about VMT and how it's treated in the model. I guess one of the questions, this is I think for Francis, is how the calibration got done to state projections. And then it leads to the question of whether VMT is an input or an output. And I think it was said earlier that it's an output, but could you explain a little more detail how that works? And I think this also goes to the question of how price sensitivity of VMT to changes in price, gas prices, or in the policy cases, of course, carbon prices.
Sure. So vehicle miles traveled is projected within the model based on a number of factors, including projections of population and the number of licensed drivers, what the demographics look like, as well as the amount people drive, which is affected by the cost of driving, which is affected by both the price of the fuel as well as the fuel economy of the vehicles, and income and several other factors. So we took the standard NEMS projection, which is projecting regional VMT, and to calibrate to the states, states projections, we basically shifted that curve as a little bit as needed to match the growth that are in the state's projections for the reference case. Now, when we run policy cases, the underlying drivers of VMT will remain, and so the model will remain sensitive to how fuel prices and other factors will affect driving patterns.
Again, for Francis, the reference case assumes fairly significant sales of electric vehicles in 2032. And the question is, what does the model assume about charging infrastructure, and will there be enough charging infrastructure to support that level of sales, and how does the model deal with that?
So the model makes an assumption about infrastructure being built as it's needed, and so as sales increase, there's an assumption that the private sector will respond and build out fueling stations. And so there is an assumption that that will not be necessarily a hindrance to people buying vehicles. There may be still sub-factors of the EVs with shorter ranges, people having range anxiety, but that's different than charging stations.
Okay. For Chris or for Francis, the question about how the model captures carbon market dynamics. What aspects of the carbon market does it include? Does it include banking and other types of aspects of an allowance market?
So for this study, basically we have constructed a carbon market in the transportation sector that's regional, that we needed for this study. We will be able to look at banking, which is the sort of the intertemporal, meeting a cap sooner or later in order to make it more cost effective in the long run. So the model will sort of solve for the carbon allowance price that's necessary to meet the cap in each of the going forward years. And if banking is part of the policy, it will allow that to be incorporated as well.
And
Great.
Thanks, Francis. I'll just add, since you brought up this sort of flow chart again, up at the top there you see arrows going back and forth, and that's that as the model sort of figures out an allowance price, that determines how much allowance auction revenue the states have available to invest in clean transportation, and those investments will then sort of affect the emissions within the model, which then also affects how the model meets the cap and the resulting allowance price. There's sort of a feedback loop there that we've incorporated into the modeling framework, so that it accounts for not just what the cap does, but what the investments do and how the investments affect what the cap does.
Great, thanks, Chris. And while this slides up, this is James at Georgetown. We are also getting questions about health impacts modeling and how that's going to be estimated. And so since this is up, I'll just reiterate, I think, a point you made earlier. We're working with the Harvard School of Public Health, and output from the energy and transportation system modeling framework that you were just describing, Chris, will be fed into the health impacts modeling. And that's something we're actively working with them on. There's also a question about pollution hotspots and how that will be captured. For a regional modeling exercise, we won't be able to have results at the level of granularity of, say, neighborhood or community level, but we are working toward having results at the county level. So with that work with Harvard. So some counties are small and you can definitely get a sense of hotspots, but the county level is the area we'll be working to identify pollution impacts on public health.
And again, to reiterate what I mentioned before, is that the modeling is sort of one source of information on that topic, and another really important source is the conversations we've had at the regional and state level workshops with communities.
Thanks, Chris, for reiterating that point.
Modeling question for Francis. Does the reference case provide information on the rate of vehicle turnover? For example, or how long vehicles remain on the road, and how is this determined in the model? Is it an input or an output, and how does NEMS calculate that?
So the model does obviously track stock, and it actually tracks stocks by vintage, and there is an assumption about basically a survival curve that says what is the probability, or what's the average life loss of vehicles as they age. And so at first, vehicles obviously survive many years, and then as vehicles get older and older, more of them are taken off the road for a variety of reasons. So that assumption is a user input assumption, and we're using the EIA standard assumption about those survival curves or scrappage rates.
Great, thanks very much, Francis.
Question about how the model deals with highway and new road construction. Is that something that's determined in the model, or how does NEMS address that?
NEMS doesn't explicitly address the question of road construction in the transportation area. There is something in the industrial model that has consumption of asphalt and need in the refinery model to produce asphalt for road construction. But within the transportation model, there is no, I think that question alludes to the question of congestion potentially, and is congestion getting worse over time or not? And NEMS is really agnostic on that topic. That's sort of a finer level of granularity and temporal resolution that is not really possible to do in a national energy model.
And another question about how the model works. Does the model look at sort of mode shifting? If people shift, say, from their cars to trains or buses?
The model inherently has some response to price in terms of people driving less and then using transit more. I think in this exercise, the most important place that modal shift will come in is back on that complicated multi-model graphic. That's something that the investment tool will be looking at as part of the invest part of the policies. And so we will be taking information from that model to adjust the VMT within NEMS to capture that intermodal shift that's not just simply price response, but is due to further investment by the states.
Great. I've had a couple questions, maybe for those who missed the beginning or didn't catch it, about making this information public. Just reiterate that these slides will be posted on the website after this webinar, and then the recording of the webinar will also be posted. That recording will take a little bit longer to post because we'll, I think, have closed captioning added before we post it. So you have to stay tuned a little longer for the recording, but the slides we can make available right away afterwards. Let's see. So there are some questions about the, and I guess since we have this up, this slide up, is a good time to ask about the fiscal impact, the implications for fuel tax, revenues, broader macroeconomic implication of a policy. So there are a lot of questions that get to what will the policy runs do, and so that's why we tried to walk through this modeling framework and have this modeling framework slide up for you all to better understand that. But I think, as I understand it, NEMS is able to calculate implications for fuel tax revenues in as a result of policy cases or under the reference case as well. Is that correct, Francis?
We can, but again, remember that we're modeling more at the regional rather than the state-specific level.
Okay, great. That's helpful. Thank you. And then in terms of economic impact, that's really what the REMI modeling will be for. And again, that'll be after the policy case runs are completed in the coming months.
And I'll add that economic analysis in REMI will encompass a large number of impacts. The fiscal impacts you mentioned, as well as changes in how consumers are spending money. If they're, for example, buying less gas, those fuel savings will be incorporated into REMI. The impacts of infrastructure investments that we may be making under the program will be incorporated into REMI. So a large number of things that affect how money moves around in the economy, those will all be incorporated into REMI, and then it'll give us pictures of how that affects our economies and employment patterns throughout the region.
Question about sort of emerging models for transportation on demand, specifically things like mobility as a service, Uber and Lyft, and does NEMS account for those either directly or indirectly in the modeling?
In this version, EIA is working on this. It's an emerging area, and people are trying to figure out how does mobility as a service affect, in particular, vehicle miles traveled. And I think the evidence is so far it can go either way, and that's what makes it so difficult to incorporate. In these projections, there is very little specifically about mobility for service. There is a little bit. There are fleet vehicles in the model, and so I think there's a small effect of the Uberization of mobility, but it's not a significant player here explicitly.
There was a question about the percent decline in emissions over the program period, and also compared to sort of historical benchmarks. I'm not sure if we have the number for the historical benchmarks, but I think we do have the percent decline in emissions. So that number is on this slide. that's up on the screen now. That's a 20% decline in emissions between 2022, the program start period, and 2032. See, we are getting a number of questions. Thank you all. We're trying to get through them to make sure that we're not asking or answering questions that have already been asked. So please do bear with us.
One question about rural versus urban or suburban VMT, and is that all sort of lumped together in the model, or how is that differentiated, given that the questioner is saying that rural VMT can be high, and how is that addressed?
So in the NEMS modeling framework, again, this is a national energy model with a look at regional driving patterns. I think the place where the rural versus urban will come in is actually over in the investment tool, which has a more detailed, more spatial resolution about where travel is occurring. And so I think it will be treated more in that tool, and outputs from that model will be used to drive some of the health impacts and other analyses.
Great.
Another question about freight and heavy duty vehicles. And in the reference case, is there any sign of sort of what's driving growth in VMT in freight, and what is the trend there in the reference case?
So the trend, as we saw, was an increase in VMT over time. For trucking, especially the heavy trucking, the primary driver is outputs of different kinds of products that need to be moved from where they are produced to where they are consumed. And so the projections inside of NEMS are tied to the macroeconomic forecast for the industrial production of a variety of different commodities. And so the implications for trucking depends on the commodity. Obviously, some commodities are moved more by truck, some more by rail. Coal being an example, it's moved more by rail than by truck. Other things like, finished electrical equipment is moved often more by truck. So, and food, things like that. So, so I think I don't know if that answered your question, but answered the question. But basically, it's driven by economic growth, an assumption that you need to continue to move goods as things are produced.
Great. So let's sort of lump a couple questions here. One, there was a question of who's running the incidence model as we look back at the program framework, and I'll just quickly answer that question. The resources for the future, we'll be doing that. There's another question about fuel costs. How are fuel costs modeled? And in NEMS.
So in NEMS, fuel prices are projected. Well, fuel prices such as highway fuel prices, I think, is probably the primary question about gasoline and diesel prices, are projected within the refinery model, or the liquid fuels model, which is actually doing both petroleum refining as well as biorefining. And it's highly dependent on the world oil price. There are a lot of other factors that affect the retail prices as well, but probably the biggest driver is the growth in the world oil price. And so we are using in this process, I think there's in fact, it's up on the screen. We are using as the starting point the reference case that comes with the reference set of resources and world conditions that lead to the reference case oil prices, which are shown here. The oil in the TCI cases, the retail prices may move somewhat. They are affected by, they are endogenous. This is an output, not an input. So.
Great. We have a lot of questions about the policy cases to come, and we hear you, and that is definitely the next step in this process. So please do stay tuned for updates on that. And if you have suggestions or ideas on what should be considered, and also sensitivity runs, whether it's battery costs or federal policy or fuel prices, those are under consideration, and we'd welcome your thoughts on those. But again, that's really the next step and the purpose of this webinar, and everything, the results that you've seen here, and there were some questions for clarification on this, are just from the reference case. Again, that is a scenario with no regional policy, where no regional policy is in effect yet. And so, yeah, these declines in emissions that are projected are assuming no policy, and one of the big drivers, as we've discussed earlier, is that as electric vehicle battery costs and vehicle costs come down, there will be more deployment of those. And of course, there's also an assumption that the federal standards for vehicles and emissions remain in place, and that's another driver in conjunction with those EV deployment levels.
A couple questions about assumptions in auto markets, but one that I'll flag is a question about what is assumed about the used car market, both for electric vehicles and for conventional vehicles in the modeling.
It's implied in the model. It's not explicit. There is not a tracking of first car ownership versus used car markets. So vehicles are on the road. We talked before about the survival curves. It's true that over lifetime of a vehicle, often it does move from one owner to another, but that's not something that's tracked within the NEMS framework.
Got another modeling question for you, Francis, and that is, I think that there's a question about the power sector and load, changes in load as a result of EV deployment, and how that is addressed. And this, of course, again, this is the reference case, and so that could be even more important in policy cases as well, and to look at the difference between the two when we get to that stage. So maybe you could say a bit about that, how it's treated in the model.
So the connectivity between the demand models, in this case transportation, and the electricity model is the demand models basically project annual electricity demand, and there is an assumption about the timing of when that electricity is used. For example, air conditioning in homes will be used primarily in the summer and primarily in the middle of the day. The assumption about charging for electric vehicles is that a large number of people will charge at night. So the load shape for EV charging is heavily at night, but there is also assumed to be some commercial charging during the day as people go around their trips at the office or whatever. So the increased electricity demand will be seen as more demand that needs to be met by the electricity sector. Electricity sector will then accommodate its projection of capacity and requirements and generation to meet that load, additional load.
Great, thanks very much, Francis. Are there any remaining questions?
Just one quick question, just to clarify this. The question about the emission projections there, and whether that's just for a reference case or for some policy scenario, and it is just for the reference case. We will be modeling policy scenarios in the future, but that trajectory is a reference case trajectory of the business as usual.
So I hope we got to most of your questions. We're at the top of the hour here, and again, we've had a lot of questions. Will these slides be made available? Yes, all of the slides that are being shown here, including the backup or appendix slides, will be posted and be a resource for you and anyone else. Again, we will also be posting a recording of this, but that'll take a few days to get up because we need to do closed caption on that first. Please do submit any comments, particularly more extended comments you might have about that the state should take into consideration as policy runs are ongoing in the coming months. And you can post those on the TCI website. There's a link for public comments that's shown here in terms of next steps. So you can submit your input. You can also, in writing on the form, but then also add attachments with resources and references. Chris or Christine or anyone else want to add anything before we wrap?
Nope, thanks so much for all your input.
Yep, thank you.
Great, thanks everyone. Have a great day, and really appreciate all of your input. And we'll look for updates in the coming weeks and months.